Welcome back to the Algarve. Well, this is the test many of you have been waiting for. Should I have bought the V-Strom instead of my Transalp? Well, this is probably the closest head-to-head I've ever done. They're very similar bikes on paper and in price, but quite different to ride, perhaps more so than you'd think actually, and at the risk of giving the game away right at the start, there's no clear winner. It all depends on what your priorities are. I'll tell you at the end which one I prefer, but don't expect a runaway winner. The very first difference I notice is when I get on. Unlike with the taller Transalp, I don't need to stand on the foot pegs to swing my right leg over the Suzuki. It's all relative, of course, and will depend on your height and suppleness, but the V-Strom is noticeably lower, seat, tank and dash. There's less bike in front of you than with the Transalp. It's more substantial than a naked, of course, but the Transalp feels as if it's from a size class above. You sit in the Honda rather than on the Suzuki. You'll almost certainly have your own personal preference depending on your height, etc., but it's definitely something you need to try for yourself. So the V-Strom feels the smaller bike, and the riding position is also slightly wristier. By that I mean you're canted slightly further forward than on the very upright Transalp, and there's slightly more weight on your wrists. In terms of softness, both seats are on a par, but the V-Strom's is wider towards the back, and this does give you a bit more comfort. However, the pillion hump seemed further forward than on the Transalp, meaning I couldn't sit as far back as I would have liked. It was easier to stand up on the Suzuki, however, the bars are easier to reach, and the slimmer tank means your overall position is more natural. If standing up is something you do regularly off-road, then this is definitely something you need to consider. I'm 187 centimeters, or just over 6'1", by the way. The V-Strom's suspension feels very similar to Transalp's, i.e. on the soft side, but this knob means it's way easier to adjust preload than on the Honda, which is a fiddly job requiring a C-spanner, so a definite win here for the Suzuki, which also gets gold forks compared to the Transalp's boring black ones. I know they're not for everyone, it's not really that important, but I like them, and I'm slightly envious that the new Triumph 400 Scrambler gets them when my much more expensive Speed Twin has to make do with black. The V-Strom's handlebars are much wider than they are on the Transalp, I'd say by a good 5 or 6 centimeters, a couple of inches. This is useful off-road, but it made the bike feel just a tiny bit ungainly on the road, which, as regular viewers know, is where I do 99% of my riding, so I do prefer the feel of the Honda on the tarmac. Now, in terms of wind protection, it's a definite win for the Honda. The Suzuki's standard screen is very short, good for off-roading again, but pretty hopeless on faster roads and at cruising speeds. Also, as I mentioned at the start, there's less bike in front of you, and the tank offers less protection from the wind, despite having a capacity of 20 litres to the Transalp 17. You definitely sit on this bike, as I said, rather than in the Honda. What about the engine? Well, this is perhaps the biggest difference, and it's a big win for the V-Strom. There's noticeably more torque low down, and it's more fun than the Transalp, which needs revving to access the power. The Honda does ultimately feel faster if you wring its neck, and it probably would win in a drag race from a standing start. It does rev more willingly, but you still have to wait for the horsepower, whereas with the Suzuki, you'll get it much more low down. I certainly couldn't feel the V-Strom's 20 kilo weight disadvantage compared to the Transalp when riding, but I could feel it a little bit when pushing the bike around. The gearing is taller on the Transalp, which means you're under 5,000 revs per minute at 140 kilometers an hour, 90 miles an hour, but the V-Strom has an engine that overall suits my riding style better, no denying that, except there's one caveat, and it's a big one that unfortunately for me negates the torque advantage. Now, this isn't going to be a problem for all of you, especially if you live in a cooler climate, and I guess it could even be considered a bonus in winter. But to me, I'm afraid it would be a deal breaker, and it's the heat the engine throws out on the Suzuki. It was only 28 degrees centigrade, 82 Fahrenheit during my test ride, which isn't bad for late July in the Algarve, and I did have my mesh summer riding trousers on, but both my left and right calves got quite a roasting. Not quite Ducati level roasting, but it was still uncomfortable, and I kept having to splay my lower legs outwards to move them away from the engine and get a bit of a cooler air from the wind. The Transalp, thankfully, suffers from none of this, staying remarkably cool even in the hottest weather. I mean, the engine does get hot, of course, but I never feel the heat on my legs when I'm riding, even when I've got my mesh trousers on. In terms of standard equipment, the V-Strom gets an up and down quick shifter, which was excellent, on a par with the Transalps, which you have to pay extra for. The screen on the Suzuki is slightly better than the Hondas, in that it seems a bit brighter and the font sizes are bigger. There's also a USB socket on the left of the screen, which is more useful than the optional old-style 12-volt socket on the Transalp's dash, and the USB-C placed right at the back of the bike under the seat. You get a few bits of protection for free on the V-Strom, like handguards and a bash plate, but these are plastic, and so I'm not sure how well they'll fare in a fall. Okay, better than nothing, I suppose, but if I'm going to fit better quality aftermarket solutions, I'd rather start with a clean canvas rather than bin plastic parts that I've already paid for. You also get ambient temperature and fuel range on the Suzuki, both of which are inexplicably missing on my Honda, but at least I get grip angle. Neither bike has cruise control, which I know is a deal breaker for many. You get an accessory bar as standard on the V-Strom. I had to buy one for my Transalp, but it was only about €12. $15 on AliExpress, and is remarkably good quality, and also fatter than the skinny job on the V-Strom, which is going to require some beefy adapters or spacers to allow most mounting solutions to be used. The mirrors are vibration free on both bikes, but the Suzuki's seem slightly larger and offer a better view of what's going on behind. Space is tighter under the V-Strom's seat. I can cram more in on the Transalp, not much more, but it's a small win for the Honda on that score. As I mentioned, the quick shifters on both bikes are excellent, although some of the V-Strom's downshifts were slightly on the brutal side. It was also more difficult to find neutral and kick down to first when coming to a stop on the V-Strom. The Transalp wins on brakes, but only just. There's significant fork dive on both bikes under heavy braking, but the Suzuki's extra suspension travel means that dive is even more pronounced, almost to the point of being comical. I am used to the fork dive on the Transalp, but the first hard brake on the V-Strom took me by surprise. Also, and this may be something specific to the test bike I rode, there was a bit of squeaking coming from the front brakes when I pulled up to a complete stop. Other than that, it's a pretty even match. Fit and finish. Another draw. The V-Strom has slightly more plastic. I'm thinking here of the standard fit bash plate, which would really need beefing up if you're serious about taking the bike off-road, and the rear rack, which I think is plastic, albeit very good quality, as opposed to the cast alloy used on the Transalp. Paintwork is excellent on both bikes, although the clear coat on the V-Strom doesn't seem quite as premium as it does on the Transalp. The switchgear on the V-Strom feels nicer to use though, and of course you don't have the inverted horn indicator setup, which is unique to Honda and therefore annoying if you own several different brands of motorbike. You also get a bolt-on rear subframe on the Suzuki, which should make the bike easier to repair in the event of a serious crash. Might be a plus point to some. I think Suzuki missed a trick in not giving the V-Strom cruise control and or tubeless tyres, as this would really have set them apart from the competition. How about noise? Well, this is another parallel twin, so you're not going to get the creamy smoothness of a Honda Goldwing. Both bikes, if I'm honest, can sound a little bit agricultural. The Transalp does have a way better exhaust note, however, and this despite the V-Strom's huge and I have to say inelegant end can. You get a beefier note and the occasional pop and crackle on the Honda, not much at all on the Suzuki. Off-road. Well, I'm afraid this is as close to off-road as I could find on the short test ride. Sorry, I know a lot of you are keen to know how the two bikes compare on this score, but A, I didn't have time, as I say, and B, off-roading isn't really my forte. As I've said before, I bought the Transalp with the intention of touring, with the option of short escapades down gravel roads when the fancy takes me. That said, even with my limited skills, I could feel that the V-Strom is the better of the two on this kind of terrain, thanks to its smaller stature, better low-down torque and easier standing position. So if you're serious about going off-road, then the Suzuki makes more sense. As a very rough guide, I'd say if you're in the market for a genuine off-road bike, then the Tenere remains hard to beat. Bit of both, go for the V-Strom, and if like me you're really only interested in the occasional escapade down a fire track, then go for the Transalp. How about two-up riding? Well, along with the BMW 850 GS, the Transalp is one of the best mid-size adventure bikes if you're taking a pillion. The grab handles are nice and wide and ideally positioned to counter the effects of braking and acceleration. The passenger gets a spacious seat, and the rear shock, although it can be a bit lazy, does glide nicely over bumps and potholes. We only tried the V-Strom briefly, but Mrs. RM found it less comfortable than the Transalp, mainly because she found that the grab handles were too far back and too tight up against her legs. The standard rubber pegs did help with the vibrations though, and she said that it was overall just as roomy as the Transalp. What about the way these two bikes look? Well, I don't really want to get drawn into a debate about appearance as it's too subjective, so I'll leave it entirely up to you. All I will say from a purely personal point of view is that I think the Transalp's headlight is too small and the V-Strom's exhaust is too big. And for what it's worth, overall, I prefer the Honda. So what's the verdict after this short initial ride? Well, there isn't one really, at least not in the sense of a personal recommendation. You need to try them both and decide what sort of riding you're going to be doing. Off-road Suzuki, long distance Honda. For what it's worth, I continue to think I made the right choice for me. I rarely stray off-road, even if I do like having the option to do so, and that heat from the Suzuki's engine puts it out of the running for me, at least while I'm here in southern Portugal. I like the torquey engine a lot, but the wide bars and slightly wristy position compared to the upright Africa twin-like comfort of the Transalp mean that overall it's not quite for me. Right, I'm taking a couple of weeks off now. See you probably towards the end of August. Enjoy the rest of your summer, ride safe, and as always, thanks for watching.